The port was never quiet. Even when the rest of the city slept, the cranes still swung their steel arms in slow arcs, the ships groaned against the docks, and the sea slapped against concrete walls in endless rhythms. Diesel fumes hung like a film in the air, mixed with brine and rust. At night, the floodlights turned the container stacks into towering shadows, alleys of colorless steel where men worked and sometimes vanished. The first disappearance caused little stir. A dock worker missed his morning shift, his boots and lunch tin left behind in the locker room. Men shrugged, sometimes people walked away. But then another man was gone, then another, until the union meeting swelled with anger and fear. The police called it organized crime, a struggle for territory. But among the men who carried cargo and tied ships, whispers told of something worse: containers used not for trade, but as coffins. The harbor was no longer just a place of work. It was becoming a place of fear, and the sea's horizon carried more questions than answers. The Union Hall was packed, voices rising in overlapping waves. Dock workers stood shoulder to shoulder, faces flushed with anger and fear. Some demanded strikes, others begged to shut the harbor until answers came. Outside, their families waited, mothers clutching photos, children staring at the ground. Despite the noise, the work never slowed. Ships still arrived heavy with cargo, their captains impatient, their deadlines unyielding. Men lined up for shifts, desperation outweighing dread. A job was a job, and in a city where wages vanished as quickly as tides, no one could afford to stay home. The disappearances carried a pattern. Men last seen during night shifts, near the berths closest to the sea. No one heard cries for help, no one saw a struggle. They simply walked into fog and never walked back. Detectives came with notebooks, boots crunching on gravel as they questioned supervisors. Their questions were always the same. When was he last seen? Who was nearby? Was there any trouble? But the answers dissolved into the harbor's noise. Everyone had theories, no one had proof. Some workers swore they saw figures in dark coats moving between containers after hours. Others muttered about sealed units that rattled faintly, as though someone inside pounded against steel. Rumors spread like oil slicks. But the police dismissed it. Gang wars, they said. Syndicates. To the families, that explanation tasted thin, like seawater. The harbor grew quieter in its own way. Jokes faded. Whistles stilled. Men kept their heads low, hands gripping ropes tighter. The cranes kept swinging, the containers kept stacking, and shadows lengthened with each loss. One morning, a container was found left ajar on the far edge of the yard. A watchman noticed the lock dangling loose and called for police. When the doors creaked open, the smell hit first. Inside, chains clanged against steel. Dirty rags lay in a heap, stained with something too dark to be grease. The discovery never reached the newspapers. Police sealed the scene, reporters held at bay by cordons. But word spread anyway, through whispers, through the eyes of men who had peeked inside before the doors were shut. That night, fewer dock workers showed up for shifts. Some refused to enter the container yards at all, their union representatives pleading with management to suspend work. But management knew the truth. Shutting down the port meant losing millions, and money weighed heavier than fear. By morning, ships still docked, cranes still lifted, and men still vanished. When the fourth man disappeared in daylight, panic surged. He had been tying ropes near the pier, sweat dripping as the sun burned overhead. A truck rumbled by, blocking the view for only seconds. When it passed, the ropes hung loose. He was gone. This was no ghost story. It was human. Planned. Efficient. Detectives mapped the vanishings, tracing patterns through manifests and ship records. They found names of vessels that didn't appear on official logs, containers that vanished mid-route, crews who disembarked without notice. Each thread pulled lead deeper into a snarl of corruption. The harbor was not merely a place of smuggling. It was a network, a vein carrying contraband, money, and lives across oceans. Dock workers weren't just victims of random violence, they were resources, captured and consumed. The police whispered among themselves about international rings, about companies built from shadows, about container ships that left port under false names and never returned. Rumors turned to revelations when a retired sailor spoke to detectives in hushed tones. He remembered voyages where extra containers were loaded with no record, where muffled cries came from inside, drowned out by the churn of engines. He had turned a blind eye then, but guilt cracked him open now. The disappearances were not coincidence. They were part of a system. One detective followed the trail further than most. He traced shell companies to offshore accounts, identified captains with forged papers, and marked a ship scheduled to leave under a false flag. He wrote notes feverishly, his pen scratching late into the night. But the next morning, his car was found near the pier. The driver's seat empty, the passenger seat holding his badge and notebook, pages torn. His colleagues stared at the sedan in silence. They knew what it meant. The ring had seen him coming. The city's fear deepened. It wasn't just dock workers who vanished now. It was police. Families begged for protection, unions shouted louder, and still the port carried on. Officials debated closing the harbor, but the economy bled too much. Money and politics wrapped around every decision, squeezing out humanity. The cranes didn't stop. The containers didn't pause. Ships still came, their bellies heavy with secrets. The break came by accident. A container arrived missealed, its lock poorly fastened. When opened, the officers braced for a corpse. Instead, they found a man, alive, gaunt, bound with ropes, his eyes blinking against sudden light. It was one of the missing dock workers. His story spilled out in gasps. He had been grabbed during a night shift, drugged, shoved into steel darkness. Inside, he'd heard voices, foreign tongues, plans whispered about shipments not recorded. He wasn't the only one taken, he said. Most never saw daylight again. Containers were dropped overboard, swallowed by the sea. The revelation spread like fire. The harbor wasn't cursed, it was engineered. The disappearances were a business, containers used as cages, as graves. The city roared. Protests erupted at the gates. Families of the lost stormed offices, clutching photos and demanding bodies. Reporters flooded the docks with cameras, their headlines screaming of smuggling, murder, and betrayal. The port's reputation cracked wide open. Raids followed. Sirens wailed as police stormed yards, cutting locks, opening containers. Some were empty, others were not. Smugglers ran, their faces caught in floodlight, their hands bound in cuffs. But the damage was irreversible. For every survivor, there were dozens lost. Families clung to hope, but hope dissolved when containers were pulled from the sea, rusted and silent, their contents unspoken. Politicians made promises, investigations thundered, but the sea remained indifferent. For every ring dismantled, another thrived offshore, beyond reach. The port was too vast, too essential, too tangled in money to ever be clean. The cranes moved on, as they always had, their steel arms swinging cargo above concrete. Men still worked, though with eyes over shoulders, ears tuned to silence. The harbor had swallowed its dead, and it would again. The port still breathes. Ships arrive, cranes groan, the sea slaps against the walls. To outsiders, it looks the same. But to those who work its veins, nothing is unchanged. They glance over shoulders, speak in hushed tones, carry their fears like weights. Official reports claim the harbor is secure, that the ring has been broken. But men still whisper of containers sealed with silence, of ships that vanish under false names, of cries muffled by the hum of engines. The harbor does not forget. It swallows. It buries. And with each tide, it promises to take more.